All right, we are live, MythVision podcast. Your host, Derek Lambert. It's been a minute since I've done a live stream, and why not come out kicking this new live stream out post New Year's with a bang? And I mean a big bang. What if Marcion, what if the guy we call Marcion, that heretic, right? What if he was first? What if this guy's gospel was earlier than some of the gospels we see in the New Testament, or maybe even all of them? I don't know. Let's dig into the weeds, because I have always been curious to know more about Marcion, and our guests, plural today, all have something to contribute in that conversation. Today on my left is or on my right, if you're watching the screen, is Dr. Markus Vincent. I have, is it your PhD now, right, Jack?
Yes, indeed.
So, yeah. Dr. Jack Bull, and then Dr. Mark G. Bilby. They're all three extremely passionate about Marcion, and we're going to find out why today. So please, if you will, give us a little bit of your background, gentlemen, and let's dive into Marcion.
Yeah, thanks so much, Derek, for inviting us to this session here. And I have to say, I have more in common with you than you probably would have thought, because I grew up without Marcion and any link to him. When I was studying philosophy, theology, history, even archaeology, I never came across him. Right after 30 years of my life, I've never heard of him, let alone read his stuff. I was asked to write a book about Christ's resurrection. And I thought this is an easy task for somebody who knows the beginnings of early Christianity, at least the first 4 or 5 centuries. And by starting to write this book on the training I had, it became more and more unclear to me why Paul's writings, his letters, were received by Christians in the literature that we read in 1st, 2nd centuries, but that the gospel literature at the same time, which people claim, and I have to say, all my friends sitting here with me, they still claim that these earlier Gospels have been written somehow, at least pre-versions of this Gospel have been written in the 1st century. So that's what I believe too. And by writing this book on Christ's resurrection, I couldn't explain. And I was not the only one when I was doing my research. Even big names like Kurt Aland, this is the famous New Testament scholar who put together the Greek New Testament that we all use around the globe as scholars. Kurt Aland wrote an article and asked the question, how is it possible that in our early Christian literature of the first 2 centuries, at least first and a half centuries, we have the letters of Paul being quoted, being disputed and discussed, but none of those Gospels. So the question for me was, how is it possible to write a book about Christ's resurrection, which is so fundamental to our New Testament Gospels, at least, I would say, for the versions that we have? How is it possible that people don't talk about these Gospels, let alone about Christ's resurrection as portrayed in these Gospels, with the resurrection appearances and all of that? And I had submitted, I have written this story about Christ's resurrection, about any writing which we have from the first 2 centuries, I sifted through. The book was ready, and I had sent it off already to the publisher when I discovered it doesn't sound right still. And by digging again into the material, it appeared to me that we have to change the order of what I was told, which means Marcion was always known, for centuries, he was always known as somebody who was making use of the Gospel of Luke, that he copied it almost verbatim. And that doesn't make sense to me any longer. Why? Because Marcion is the same person who put together, at least from what we know from the sources, put together the first collection of Paul's letters. And only since we have Marcion putting together this collection, which we know is the earliest version of the New Testament, around the mid of the 2nd century, only since he had published his text, people started discussing the material which we know as the gospel material, and not before. Anything before this time that they discuss are a few sayings of the Lord, as we have them, for example, in some of Paul's letters. A few sayings which we have in other texts like 1 Clement. But nobody talked about those gospel narratives that we know of. No miracle, no wonder working, nothing, no appearance after Easter. And so the only result that I could imagine, and I thought I would test it, was to reverse the order. And as some had claimed before in the 19th century already, that Marcion might be the earlier gospel, just as he was presumably the first to put together a New Testament collection, albeit his collection was small. I mean, it was just one gospel, and it was just 10 letters of Paul and not 14 as we have them. And I sent another draft to the publisher and said, I have to add to the book a subtitle. Instead of saying it is about Christ's resurrection, I mentioned that we should have the book as Christ's resurrection and the making of the New Testament, which was a bold statement, of course. The publisher at the time, Ashgate, now Routledge, bought into it. And the book was published as it is, just 250 pages. But it was a bang. It was a bang insofar as I received reviews, scholarly reviews from colleagues that were 27, almost 30 pages long. I mean, more than 10% of what the book's length is. And I thought, again, something is wrong. I mean, if I think the book is crap, I say it in 2 sentences, or probably if I'm nice and charming, because we are colleagues, I might do it in half a page. Yeah. But if I have to spend 3, 4, 5 days to grapple with a bloody small book in order to defeat the argument, something is extremely wrong. And by looking through the arguments of all the reviewers, and I've got an enormous list of reviewers, it boils down to 2 responses. A, I was told my calculation and the datings of what I suggested, namely that all these Gospels, which we have, are post 140, so mid-2nd century literature. And the reason for dating these texts earlier all boil down to 2 other texts which were supposed to make references to the Gospels as we have them. One is the so-called Didache, and the other one are the letters of Ignatius. Now, the Didache is our earliest catechism, and indeed quotes Matthew more sayings than anything else. And the second are the letters of Ignatius, on which Jack knows much more than I do, and he will talk about it a bit later, because he did his PhD with me on the Ignatian letters. But what I discovered, and just to start Jack later off, I looked into the Ignatian letters and discovered that the earlier version, which is attested in manuscripts, were only 3 letters of Ignatius. And here, those so-called quotations of those Gospels are missing. And the version where the version, it gets better, I tell you. The version of the Ignatian letters that have Gospel quotations, I mean, numerous ones, even Old Testament quotations, are preserved in the oldest manuscript that we have, which is called a manuscript Hierosolumitanus from the 11th century. Now, this manuscript offers us the Ignatian letters in a widely expanded version. It's not the 3 letters, it's a 7 letters collection, and adjacent with it, a 14 letter collection. And the 14 letter collection became the standard collection, which was known throughout the medieval period until more recent times. And these are the letters which are full of gospel quotations. Now, the Didache, the oldest Greek manuscript that we have, is the same manuscript. So when we know that the Ignatian letters that are being preserved are held in a manuscript which has blown up these Ignatian letters into full-sized quotation letters of the Gospels, how can we be sure that the Didache, which derives from the same manuscript, has not undergone the same blow-up and a gospelizing of this Didache? It all boils down to one thing: the so-called 2 sources that were advanced against the redating of these Gospels from an early dating to a mid-2nd century dating just fell apart like a card house. It's a medieval view how these texts were dated. So that's just my intro. That started me off, and since then, this was about 2010. I've spent a good deal of my life in digging deeper, exploring actually what I didn't know and what I wasn't told when I studied. Just like you, Derek, you weren't told. And I guess Jack and Mark were neither told things like that in their school time. So I had to do it myself. But that was the passion which allowed me to go deeper and to see what we can find.
Before we move to Mark, and then we'll get to Jack, I guess we're going in this order. I just have one question, and this is for the viewer more than anything, is that you're not alone in these observations overall. I'm sure you have your particulars that you might hold to that others don't hold to, but the idea that Marcion is early and that there is something going on, almost like a conspiracy, though it's not that kind of conspiracy. It's almost like a cover-up or something that has somehow politically and for power reasons maybe have been pushed in a certain direction against Marcion. You're not alone in this idea that Marcion is actually early, correct?
No, you're not correct. I'm still alone. Alone in one point.
Okay.
Despite all my friends who are sitting with me tonight, and despite all other friends and colleagues with whom I'm exploring this material, I'm alone in the sense that I still believe that Marcion is not just a collector, he's not just a reviser, he's not just somebody who has built a text almost by doing nothing to a text or to texts that he found. I mean, even my great colleagues who I revere and admire, right, are still holding that the basic format of this text, be it the Gospels, be it the 10 Pauline letters, are texts which have been absorbed by Marcion more or less and without doing much to these texts. If I'm misinterpreting you, Mark, or Jack, please correct me. But even people who are not sitting with us tonight, Matthias Klinghardt, Judith Liu, and many, many others, they all agree in the meantime that the texts, Marcion's Gospel and Paul's letters, are earlier than what we have as canonical texts. But they still believe that Marcion has little or pretty much nothing to do with these texts, except that his name got attached to these texts because people ridiculed Marcion for having used these texts as the New Testament. So
another way of
I can assure you I'm still alone, and it doesn't make me uncomfortable being alone.
So another way to simply say what you said is that most, even the ones who agree with you, Marcion's early, is that Marcion inherited literature that is prior, that he didn't tinker with, change, most likely, or if he did it, it's very minor ways, it's not significant. you think a significant change happened? Do you think he inherited it, or do you think he may have ex nihilo created much of what you see?
First of all, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think it is the question, what is the contribution Marcion did? And the second question is, what did he inherit? Or was it just fiction, which would quite nicely fit the MythVision? But I have to disappoint those MythVisioners, right, who believe that it's all fiction.
Right.
I think he's
that's not me,
writer.
by the way, but go ahead.
Yeah, I think he's a good writer, yeah, but he's not a Shakespeare. But even Shakespeare had some material on which he built his stories and dramas. Now the question is, if he is a bit less than Shakespeare, so he has more material on which he latches and which he makes use of, what is the nature of this material? And here, I think I have to admit tonight, we are pretty innocent right now, and we are still exploring these earlier layers before what has been received. I am a firm thinker who bases things, or tries at least to base things, not on hypothesis, but on data and facts. And that's how we got together. But then we will explore tonight, and probably in the next weeks, that even our attempts not to build our stories on hypotheses, on ideas, but on data, is a tricky one, because none of us works without prejudices, none of us without agendas. And we've just had an exchange today, Mark and me and Jack, where we are still exploring where are our agendas sitting, where are our prejudices sitting, and is what we provide data or is it hypothesis? And I sent an email to Mark today by saying, if we start to say that data are based on hypothesis, I'm out. Because I think scholarship is not about hypothesis, it's about dismantling judgments and hypotheses and going back to data. And that's why we got to know each other, because I know Mark is working with data, Jack is working with data, I'm working with data, but it is a tricky thing, as we know from the American elections. All people claim the data are clear and only my data are right.
Everybody's right with their data. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So let's get to Mark here. Mark, welcome to MythVision, my friend. Again, you've made an appearance in a previous interview I did once with our good friend, Jacob Berman, and you're bringing something unique and different. Please lay that out for us.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I've been aware of Marcus's work for a while and Matthias Klinghart's work for a while, Joseph Tyson, and Jason Badoon's work. So there are, several scholars working on Marcion. What I saw was that there was just a lot of subjectivity or idiosyncrasy in the approaches to especially Marcion's Gospel. And so if we were going to try to take a data-driven approach to investigating these early years and the formation of this early literature in Christianity, we need to just normalize the data. And I think this is where the prejudices come in, is from very early on. Irenaeus gives us a narrative by which we reconstruct and understand all of this stuff. So we call these books Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Why do we do that? It's not because it's in the original books themselves, quite likely. It's because that's what Irenaeus told us we were supposed to call these books. Right. And we're supposed to understand them as harmonious and as early and first century. So there's a whole narrative there.
Jab in, by the way, occasionally to emphasize, because this is going to be, ladies and gentlemen, warning up front, weeds. Okay. When I say weeds, this goes deep. So you have to put your coffee in your hand or your tea, whatever you prefer, and get ready for the ride. So Dr. Bilby, just to emphasize, when you said Irenaeus, we learned from Marcus and Jack and you, all three kind of emphasize, we only have in that earlier 3 letters. We don't have all 7. So is this in his 3 that he names the gospel authors?
Yeah, Irenaeus. Okay, so there's Ignatius.
Or did I say Ignatius?
Yeah, there's Ignatius with the
Okay,
3
I got
letters,
you.
7 letters, 14 letters. And then there's
Okay.
Irenaeus, who wrote around 180. He was a bishop in southern France,
Forgive
basically.
me, I miss.
That's okay. So yeah, Irenaeus is the reason we have the idea of the 4 gospel canon. At least he's the earliest person to give us that notion. And he gives us the narrative that comes to dominate. I don't think it was necessarily dominating in every circle, for the first several hundred years in which there was something like Christianity or Jesus followers. Marcionism was probably a pretty significant movement. Manichaeanism was a very significant movement in various parts. Some of it depended on where you lived in the empire. If you're living in Syria, if you're living in ancient Persia, you would have encountered forms of Christianity that did not look like what was happening in Rome. Irenaeus's model, you would have been encountering one gospel, not 4 gospels, because they're all combined into one. So, there's diversity, and you can see that in manuscripts and all this sort of stuff. Anyway, when it came to Marcion's texts and how we reconstruct them, what I saw is that there was just massive disagreement. You could have people like Harnack and Roth who reconstructed Marcion's Gospel, for instance, and they came up with about 4,000 words of content. Matthias Klinghardt comes up, when he does the same thing, he comes up with 13,000 words of content. So there's just an enormous disparity. Andrea Nicolotti in Italy did one as well. He's more like 11,500 words. But we didn't even have our bearings really before I did these data sets. So I was the first person to publish data sets of the Marcionite texts so that we could actually get a handle on what the data is, and that we could start to do things like correcting for bias, detecting bias, right? And evaluating common trends. Speaking of, I'll bring this up real quick. We have a member on our team who's actually a legitimate hard scientist, applied mathematician, statistician. He's a grad student at Columbia. His name's K. Lance Lotharp, and he's absolutely brilliant. So he probably hears me bragging on him, but he's put together, I think this is the first time this has ever happened in gospel studies. And, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we just started up a Kaggle data science competition. So if I can share my screen just real quick.
Absolutely. And just while you're doing that, ladies and gentlemen, if you like what you're hearing, you could support the guest by going and checking out some of the books Markus Vincent has written. There's also Patreon. Sorry, you can go support these guys. So if you want to see more Marcion stuff, back the Marcion scholarship, and that's the best way to keep this stuff growing.
So for our data science and coding geeks out there, we now have a competition where you can use data science to try to reconstruct a plausible version of Marcion's Gospel. And basically it takes all the past reconstructions, and then it uses the most recent one, which was by Jason Badoon in Greek, and Jason and I collaborated on that. So the idea is as kind of a scientific experiment, using all the past reconstructions from about 200 years. Can you take that data and somehow do pattern extrapolation from it, and then end up with something that's close to Badoon's? And part of the reason behind the experimental design is the idea that Badoon's probably in a reasonable kind of middle ground. If we have 4,000 on one end and 13,000 on the other end, probably neither one of those guys is right, but probably the truth is somewhere in the middle. So Badoon is the most middle. He's the most like via media or kind of moderate approach, you might say, not kind of going, I call him the Goldilocks of Marcion scholars, right? He's not too hot, he's not too cold, he doesn't go too far, he's not too minimalistic. So he kind of gives us a middle ground among reconstructions. So the idea again is pattern extrapolation. So those of you who are interested in data science, please join us for this. It just went live like 2 hours ago, and Lance will be the one hosting it. Again, he's a grad student in statistics at Columbia. So he's a brilliant coder, a brilliant mathematician, and he can bring scientific rigor and really like hard science methods to this. So
is this one of the links that's in the description you sent me, or
it's not, but I'm happy to provide it. I can put it in the chat for you, and then if you want to send it out to even in the, let's see, I have access, I think, to there we go. I can put it in the regular
comments
chat
right now for everybody.
Well. Yeah, I just put it in the chat.
There you go. All right, it's there. I'll add it to the description so that it's there for anybody who wants. I'll add it under your section, Mark, just so they know where it is.
Yeah.
There, the Kaggle. Got it. All right, I just added it.
That's great.
Yeah,
it's okay. Since we're on my computer, I might as well just show some of the other things that I've been doing and working on. So one is to just compile all the evidence. I think that's an important thing that we we've been doing, but not in a rigorous way. And so I've been working with Marcus on his version of the Apostolos, giving suggestions, helping with evidence. gathering and so on. And then I've helped Badun to turn his apostolos version of Marcion scriptures into Greek for the first time. So I've completed that and a critical apparatus. So I'm kind of playing research assistant to both of these senior scholars. And, you know, I have my own research that I'm working on as well. But one of the things I want to do is popularize research on Marcion, because if it is important, then it needs to be looked at by a lot more people than just, you know, 15 scholars around the planet. It's getting more and more popular as scholars look more seriously at it. But one of the things I wanted to...
Sorry, Mark, we might just need to explain to the audience what the apostolos is.
Sure. Yeah. So Marcion has two texts, the Evangelion and the Apostolos, and then a preface to that collection that went by the name Antitheses. So it's basically something like an introduction to what might be considered our first New Testament canon, simply a gospel and then 10 letters of attributed to the Apostle Paul. So it's a much smaller New Testament canon, maybe about a third of the size of what our New Testament canon is today, or even less. But again, because scholars have been studying this stuff for 200 years, but because there's been a lot of prejudice against Marcion and his scriptures as irrelevant or late 2nd century or botched versions of Luke or the letters of Paul or what have you, you know, we're trying to kind of turn the tide and make it more about, well, let's just look at the data. Let's look at the texts. Let's gather the evidence. Let's take all of this seriously. So one of the things I've done, I was showing Derek and the group this before the show. I just started creating an open science book, and the idea is kind of to allow for citizen science. Some of your viewers might be familiar with a platform called Zooniverse. Zooniverse lets the broad citizenry of the world participate in science. So you can do things like look at space, photographs of stars, of deep planetary and star systems, and then people can classify those, because sometimes we as humans are better at classifying certain galaxy formations than a machine might be. And it's through a bunch of human inputs that the machine learning models actually get better. There's the same thing with like war diaries from World War I. So, machines might not be very good at reading cursive from 100 years ago, but humans are particularly good at that skill. And so by tagging every date and every name and every place in these diaries from wars, you can actually map out the textures and intricacies of World War I, far better than any historian ever could through this kind of crowdsourcing approach. So that's what I'm trying to do for the Marcionite stuff for the first time. So I spent the better part of the last 2 weeks doing quite a bit of coding. And what I've done is produce a book. So I hope this is looks technologically pretty cool. If you work in the hard sciences, you're used to a platform or a coding convention called LaTeX. So it was invented by a professor at Stanford in 1989. And if you're a chemist or a physicist or a biologist, you use LaTeX for all of your publications. If you're writing a thesis in computer science, you're probably using LaTeX for your publications. Nobody in religious studies uses this. Our religious studies publishers do use it, though. Brill and de Gruyter, they all use LaTeX to format their books because they want it to look clean and consistent, and they don't want to have to mess around with a bunch of inconsistent spaces and tabs and so on. So what I did is try to come at this publishing project in a scientific way by building a pipeline. So basically it takes really well-crafted data that's in a format called XML. So it's structured data, and I use a particular convention or type of XML called TEI. There's a whole group that's popular around the world it's called the Text Encoding Initiative. So it lets you really richly describe texts. It's kind of like HTML for web pages, but much richer and much more capable of describing text. So I curated a bunch of data in XML, and then I built a pipeline using something called XSLT, and then LaTeX, and then PDF, and various packages in my Linux Ubuntu machine. So right now on the fly, I'm going to let Derek let me first just English version of the book, so people can see it.
And this, just so everybody know, you're getting a sneak peek from Mark on the future, I think, of a lot of the way books I think will eventually go, especially since they're cutting back on trees and
Exactly, yeah. So this is a book that I generated. It's only got English translation. So I'm going through all the attestations we have by the church fathers, by the patristic writers to Marcion, because I want to do a careful reading of those texts and make them accessible. Marcus in his forthcoming German edition will have all these attestations in Greek and Latin, most of them, but I've been finding more of them. But I'm also interested in translating them just to make them more accessible to a broad audience so people can see the evidence for themselves. So this book is in English. You can see, I actually put Derek's name in the book to say thanks for the promotional work today. I haven't archived this, but if you look, you can see this is it's a professional looking book. I spent time crafting it to format it correctly, and here, this is kind of the meat or the substance of the book. So each attestation gets its own page where you can read the original text. So Latin here by Jerome, he says in Marcionis Apostolo. In English, that would be in Marcion's Apostles. So he's referencing this. It gives the place, the volumes. You can go look this up if you know the critical editions of the Church Fathers, English translations, what scholars think about it, and then a unique ID and some notes. And the nice thing about this is because it's an XML-based book, we can always update it and correct it and add more. But one of the things, there's a bibliography here in the back. I can point that out real quick too. That was compiled using something called Bieber. I don't think it's pronounced Bieber like Justin Bieber, but so this bibliography is compiled. But Derek, I'm going to let Derek now. It's kind of choose your own adventure role-playing game. Derek, I did this coding. Now we can produce the book with any number of translations you want. So if you like French, if you like German, it's Dutch, DE. But you could even go for the full Monty and do the 7-language version if you wanted to.
You know what? You've tempted me, and I was going to give your computer a break, but at this point, let's go with number 9. I think that's the one, right?
Okay. Yep. So I'm just going to click number 9 here. And you'll see this basically is like
I hear a background. I hear noise in the background, guys.
It's not with me. I don't know where it is. I hear some noise too.
Sounds like a TV on or something.
So if you look, Derek just selected all these languages. So now all these languages are embedded in the edition. And if you go down to the quotations, you'll see, again, the original language and then snippets in all of these different languages. There's just a book, a guy named Toma Tosabak. I think he's Czech, and he's the head of the, what's it called, Liber in Europe. And he was just promoting a book called Multilingual Digital Humanities, because in the digital humanities now, we can create not just digital books, but we can work across languages really quickly. And it turns out like our methods get much better when we're working on things in multiple languages at the same time. So anyways, that's something that I just developed, but there's also a Google form that goes along with it. So I will archive this on a platform called Zenodo during the show today. But if people want to contribute to it as a citizen science thing, you can help us dig up more attestations to Marcion's Apostolos, because we might not be finding everything, right? I'm kind of thinking of this as like finding gold, and, people like Marcus and I can work a long time digging up all the citations we can find, but we might still miss things. So if we can sort of turn loose the global public to search for all the, attestations of Marcion that are out there in all the writings of the Church Fathers, people might actually turn up more evidence that we haven't even thought about. And then through this Google form, you can basically add that, and then it's a candidate for the book. So it's still going to be expert vetted. I'm going to make sure it's legit, find it in a print source, make sure the wording is correct, check the translation, or do the translation myself, or bring in other people who are experts in these other languages. But I just wanted to do that little digital book demonstration as part of the episode today. I'm going to turn it over to Jack, but we can come back around to some of these things later.
Hey, that's awesome. And by the way, everybody, the links are in the description. I know this gets technical, but I'm looking forward to seeing some results from this. And so, Jack, we're bringing you on, man. All right. So welcome to MythVision.
Thank you so much. It's been a long time in the coming.
I know it is. And so tell us what you bring to the table, and why Marcion too. You got to give us your conversion experience along the way.
and truly, that's the best word to describe it, I think, is conversion. In many ways, I am just lucky to hang on the coattails of Marcus and Mark, but nonetheless, I am still a true convert to the Marcionite cause. About 6 years ago, I studied under Marcus in a lecture looking at early Christianity, and in it he detailed some of the controversies surrounding Ignatius of Antioch and the epistles which we mentioned earlier. And this set me on a course to find out whether Marcus was right or wrong, which then became my PhD. And I have since discovered that I think Marcus was probably right, and that most of what we know or have assumed to be true about Ignatius for the last 150 years is in fact false. And the repercussions of this to me at the time when I began this journey did not seem that great. In fact, I thought that most people would not even look at me because Ignatius of Antioch, who's heard of him, who knows him, what's the point? But what I quickly found out was that Ignatius, as Marcus mentioned, along in some ways with the Didache, acted as the last bastion of hope for those who sought to date the New Testament, and in particular the Gospels, into the first century. And the first thing that I wanted to do when I discovered that this shorter version of the Ignatian epistles was more likely genuine was to see if we had any of our New Testament references left. Where have they gone? And are we still lucky enough to have them? And the answer I found in almost a day's work, which was that there was none left. Our references to Matthew and Luke, the two Gospels that are primarily referenced by the middle recension of the Ignatian epistles, had disappeared. And references also to Paul and his letters, further gone. And so then, once you've destroyed those last two, the Didache and Ignatius, once you've destroyed those two as credible witnesses to these canonical stories, these canonical texts, you have to ask, well then, maybe as scholars we've got the whole question wrong. We are looking in the wrong direction. We're trying to see an evolution as canonical text gets more well received, rather than just accepting maybe that they weren't there, and then all of a sudden there's a great burst.
If I may just to jump in here, Jack, to emphasize,
Yes.
I had to look it up just to make sure. Wikipedia says Ignatius was around 108 to 140. This is the sweet spot. If he's talking about the Gospels and Paul, he should be. I mean, there's no reason he shouldn't be. But if, like you're suggesting, the original is just 3 letters that lacks these sources, these sayings and Paul's letters, then we're in a conundrum here. At least it opens the door to saying, hey, this is not earlier attestation. Like this, maybe Marcion's the first guy who actually does talk about this, and later they tack in to Ignatius' letters or invent epistolary fiction or something to tack on to Ignatius, right?
Yeah, very much so. And it becomes all the more strange when Ignatius, in every recension in his letters to the Romans, mentions Peter and Paul by name. So he does know of these figures, and he respects them, and he sees them as authoritative, and he makes great effort to make clear to the reader that he's not as great as they are. But yet he doesn't know his texts. He doesn't know Paul's letters. He doesn't know, more obviously, Peter's letters. But then it went further than that. And this is where Marcus's book, Resurrection and Early Christianity, really hit me hard. He has this great chapter in it where he talks about resurrection mania. So it's not just the texts that suddenly come onto the scene. It's also the theologies and thoughts of Marcion that burst onto the scene that are not present in early Christian texts. And so again, the resurrection, this great theme of Paul, the real centerpiece of all of his works, is something that is almost entirely absent in early Christian literature, including Ignatius' short recension. And yet all of a sudden with Marcion, somehow resurrection becomes quite a key point for early Christians. And you think to yourself, as modern Christians, or as what we understand of modern Christianity, that's quite a significant theme, the resurrection. That might actually be the key point. And so why is it that somehow there's this figure, this relatively obscure heretic, writing in the 140s, or at least publishing early in the 140 maybe, who creates a paradigm shift? He doesn't just introduce texts. He introduces new theologies. He introduces new ideas that would become staple bread and butter for proto-Catholic, but also for other heterodox Christians. And so this was the beginning of some of my journey of, well, if we can't find what's canonical, we have to look for something else. And the real thing that sold me on Marcion and his significance was the heresiologists through whom we know about Marcion and their obsession with him. There are many early Christian heretics. We know lots of them. but the obsession, the deep-rooted, vindictive sort of nature with which they pursue Marcion and his New Testament, particularly Tertullian and Epiphanius, strikes me that they must have seen him as a threat, a credible threat. And to be a threat, I think you have to have large numbers, or at least a relative portion of people following you. For example, if I started a new cult tomorrow, I doubt Pope Francis or the Archbishop of Canterbury would talk to me very much. But with like the Mormons, for example, everyone has to engage with it, and so too, everyone seems to feel the need to engage in the early church with Marcion, and so therefore I had no choice but to follow him. And just as a way of introducing Marcion, I feel like he's become in some way a friend. And this friendship is actually one that also extends back to the earliest parts of the church. We have received about Marcion only negative things and assumed that he has always been on the other side of the team to proto-Catholics because of people like Irenaeus and Tertullian. But it seems to me actually that in the earliest parts of Marcion's career and life, he was actually treated as a fellow Christian by Justin Martyr, for example. Alien, yes, and different, but recognized at least as part of the Christian denomination and as a follower of Jesus. And so therefore this intrigues me even further to pursue him, because we're not just dealing with an obscure, difficult, maybe idiosyncratic lunatic. We're dealing with someone who was at the time accepted, I think, as not mainstream, but certainly acceptable and within the realms of what was allowed as a Christian. And so thus I've joined on with these two, and we hope to find out some more maybe about Marcion and what he has to say.
If I can chime in here to sum up what Jack just said, the way I like to conceptualize, I haven't said this phrase before, but rather than thinking that Marcion is your crazy uncle or crazy nephew, we need to start realizing Marcion is your daddy when it comes to early Christianity. Yeah,
I think it's really interesting because I'm thinking of like other studies, like just social and psychological studies of like, if what they were wanting to do was to get people to completely forget about him, it may have worked at the time. Politically, it may have worked at the time with the Christians that they were trying to keep away from this doctrine and this guy's teachings. But in the long run, they do not have omniscience, and they do not realize they created so much smoke that now people are forced to realize there's a fire. And that's exactly why you guys exist today.
Well, there's been a recovery, and this especially in Catholic theology and historical studies for the last 60, 70 years. A French scholar named Henri de Lubac, he was part of a renaissance of Origen, right? So Origen of Alexandria was considered a heretic for the better part of the last, 1700 years. Turns out he was our greatest early interpreter of the scriptures, genius, created multiple versions of the scriptures in multiple languages. He's a fascinating person in his own right. So people like de Lubac helped us to realize Origen might be later considered a heretic, but that doesn't mean early on he was a heretic. And you can find the same story happening over and over again. Tertullian was a Catholic and he was considered Orthodox. He's the guy who taught us gave us the word Trinity for the first time. He's the guy who gave us the word person when it comes to the Trinity. And yet later he's considered a heretic, right? Augustine, there's questions about whether he remained Manichaean. That's one of Badun's specialties in his research. A lot of his Manichaean affinities might have continued on, even though his official narrative in the Confessions was that he converted back to the Catholic faith, because of his mother, right? So the more you look at it, the more you realize the line between heresy and orthodoxy is blurry, and it can change in a second. It can change in a few years.
In another way, it makes me think of Constantine. Yeah. Like, was he really a Christian, or is this a political move? Or like, these questions, maybe it's a little bit of both. I mean, there's so many interesting avenues, and we like a clean tradition. I think that's why it's easy to gravitate toward, we have a story and here's our story and we got it all figured out. Just you kick back, relax, let your legs sit up, and we've got it all figured out for you. But it's way messier than that. And there's something going on. There's a lot of smoke. So Marcus, you haven't spoken in a while, but I'm sure something interesting's in your head.
No, absolutely. Because when I hear about this kind of storyline that people usually latch to and adhere to, I think that's quite a romantic idea. It's not a very old one. I mean, it's been built up after the Enlightenment, after the 18th century, that people maneuver themselves into a streamlining of that story. Because if you think about the Reformation, and even if you think about the medieval period, people knew about this kind of messiness of the story of the 2nd and 3rd centuries and even later. Yeah, people didn't have, for example, a clear New Testament. People were striving for creating a New Testament, for example, in the 12th, 13th centuries. People knew that they had different manuscripts of New Testament collections, but with all kinds of variations, yeah, glosses at the center or at the margins, all giving different readings, quite strange ones sometimes, yeah. But in the 19th century, people were obsessed. I mean, we have this word obsession a few times today. Were obsessed in creating a clear and rigid text of the Gospels and of the New Testament. And you will not believe it, but we didn't have New Testament chairs in universities before 1870. So the creation of the New Testament tradition, if you like, or if the New Testament scholarship in strict sense, excluding patristics, excluding the Old Testament, arrives as a result from the Romantic movement, what we call in Germany the Biedermeier movement. This is the time when people like yourself didn't turn up any longer with red shirts from Baroque times and with nice trousers of all sorts of forms and colors, yeah, and hats and sombreros. No, when you start dressing as a man in black and white, and it was already a transgression from this kind of a normative attempt to streamlining life when you started dressing up in blue, right? So this is exactly what happened in scholarship about the Gospels and about the New Testament. We had a streamlining of these texts, only to discover, and it was, I think, not just the result of a postmodern craziness, but it was a discovery that this kind of a streamlining was, in fact, more of a romantic ideology than it was a display of what happened on the grounds. So when I look into what we were talking about, heretics and so forth, I think one of the discovery I made is in the 2nd century, and probably throughout the 2nd century. I'm not the first one to have seen that. We should not talk about heretics. The first, according to one of the major scholars, Alain Le Boulouec, who wrote a big book about it years ago already, he discovered that the first attempt to create what we all have in our minds, the heretics, was Irenaeus, the person we had heard a few times today. But that's the end of the 2nd century. And Le Boulouec even thinks that this first attempt that Irenaeus does in discrediting other people was quite a failure. And Mark just referred to it, and Jack as well. Tertullian, by some people seen as a heretic because he doesn't believe into the Catholic Church. He claims the Catholic Church are mediocre people, whereas the spiritual people he endorses are, in our views today, pretty crazy prophetesses in Asia Minor. Other people like Origen is, as Mark rightly said, the more important person, I think, than Irenaeus with regards to the publicizing of what we call a canonical New Testament. Whenever Irenaeus talks about a New Testament, he only endorses, not willingly, but only refers to Marcion's New Testament. The first chap that we know who endorses a New Testament, which is a canonical, our canonical one today, is Origen. Origen, of course, who then for centuries became himself under the shadow of being a heretic. So I think we should dismiss all these ideas about heresies in the 2nd centuries. What we have is in the 2nd centuries people who try to make sense of something that didn't make big sense to most people, namely that the founding father, who was referred to as the creator of Christianity, ended up as a criminal on the cross. And that was a big shot. I mean, how can you start a new cult? And how can you do it if you move away from the cult family where you derive from, namely Jews? How can you appeal to people by putting in front of your cult a failure? And what kind of answer do you have to that? You have to make up a story that he lives and that he is alive amongst the people who continue and celebrate him. And for that, I think we have loads of stories in parallel, and Mark has given us Aesop and a few others, but we have a range of these type of remakes in the Greek and in the Roman tradition. And I think this is how people then start trying to make sense how to overcome a failure and to make a success story out of it. So no heretics, I think, in the 2nd century. We're looking for the wrong people there. More of people like ourselves who try to make sense of what at first sight doesn't make much sense.
Thank you. I jumped into a live stream the other night. Mark was busy with Litwa, M. David Litwa, for those who don't know, Dr. Litwa. And I had to ask a question that I think is relevant to this first stream we're talking about Marcion here. And that was, okay, what are the implications? So we're talking about Marcion possibly being first. Okay, this is cool, but you guys seem to be very focused on Marcion, and you've been explaining details as to why. But I asked it, and it was really, Mark, you did a great job. Maybe you guys can all tackle it in your own way. But I asked, what does it matter? If he is first, how does that change what we're doing, what New Testament scholarship's doing? How does it change the origins of Christianity? You might each have a different perspective, but please, each of you starting off, let's start with you, Mark, since you tackled it last time. Then let's have Jack, and then let's have Marcus jab the last one there. How's that sound?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's helpful to talk about Marcion as a person. There are different Marcions, you might say. There's Marcion as sort of the real historical person. You might say we are, kind of together questing for the historical Marcion. Like who was he really, and when did he live, and what was he about? There's also the Marcion of heresiology, how he was depicted over the centuries. And it just kind of gets worse and worse. It's just, because once he's vilified and that becomes the standard narrative in the Orthodox churches, it just continues to be worse. Though he had adamant followers, well up until the 4th and into the 5th century. Mm-hmm. But then there's another way to think about Marcion is the texts that he had and what his role was with them, what his role was in compiling them and distributing them. How active or how passive was he in that? And then, we can also think about the substance of those texts, what's in them. And I think that last category has really been my concern. It's not so much about what role did Marcion have as much as what is the textual data that we can distill from. And again, we don't have a manuscript of Marcion's Gospel, except maybe some people think Claire Kliba and Jason Badoon think Papyrus 69 might be a Marcionite Gospel. But it's very fragmentary. But we don't have a full manuscript of the Marcionite text. But we've covered this in other episodes. Scholars like Matthias Klinghardt have shown that there's so much affinities and so many connections between readings that the church fathers give from Marcion and actual manuscripts of Luke that it really just doesn't make any sense except to think that Marcion's Gospel was sort of the first edition, you might say, and then canonical Luke was the second edition, a revised, expanded version. And then the same thing applies to the Pauline text. So it radically changes things. In terms of coming up with concrete dates, that's going to be up in the air a little bit. But almost, I would say 95% plus of New Testament scholarship is done under the assumption that Luke's Gospel is before Marcion, that Matthew's Gospel, Matthew and Mark and those with those hagiographical names, those are all earlier than Marcion and give us an earlier version of Christianity. So it pretty radically changes things if you flip it on its head, because Marcion doesn't have things like a virgin birth of Jesus. Marcion doesn't have Jesus being baptized. So, right, all of a sudden, like the Virgin Mary, she's gone. She's not a part of the story at all. So if you have a version of the story of Jesus that starts out with, pretty elaborate stories about how Jesus was born and his family and all that, if like you think about what Christmas would look like if you just took Marcion's text, there would be no shepherds, there would be no angels, there would be no wise men, right? It's just an adult, right? It's similar to Mark's gospel like that. Again, I'm hesitant to use the word Mark as a name for a person, but it's similar to that text in terms of beginning with Jesus as an adult. It's similar to other texts that we know of, like the Gospel of Thomas doesn't have an infancy story, although there is an infancy, another gospel by that name. But
real quick,
if it's earlier, then it a lot of the stuff that we take as early and standard and they're from very early decades in Christianity, we really do need to push it back to about the mid-2nd century, most likely.
Remind me after you all, because I do not want to interrupt you, but remind me on what kind of genre do the scholars who are reconstructing Marcion's gospel put it in? I know that, and this is something I really want to get into because there are apologists today who, and I'm talking about like adamant, this all is historical, what we're reading actually happened, and they're trying to harmonize unharmonizable things, in my opinion, and just kind of wild stuff. But they always say, well, the majority of scholars put this in biography, and therefore somehow gives it more realistic that this really goes back to what actually happened. Kind of, they're trying to take that angle. And I see a mix of genres and stuff that are in there, from novel to this to that, especially with Acts. But I wanted to get your thoughts about Marcion's after you each tell me if Marcion's earlier, because this is more important to answer in my opinion. Well, how does this affect us? How does this change it? Does this blow the lid off everything we thought we knew? All right, going to you, Jack.
I don't think that any university course is still relevant if we're right. I think that every single university in the world is currently teaching a bogus course on New Testament and early Christianity, because it essentially dismantles the last 150 years of everything we've known. And so there's no point even beginning to recycle any of the material. I mean, I've recently taught the Synoptic Gospels at my university in London. And I taught it the traditional way because it's my first year there, and I thought I would just sort of not break with the trend and mention Marcion briefly at the end. But as I was writing this fairly sort of traditional course, I realized that all of it was nonsense and that none of it could stay the same. Because if Marcion's Gospel is first, whether he wrote it or not, or whether he partially wrote it, whatever, it means that, especially in the case of Luke, but also for the other three, that they are all in some way dependent and engaging with him. And therefore, we have to reinvigorate the search for either a proto-gospel pre-Marcion, another Q maybe, or something else. We have to begin to look again at what we know to be early Christian, maybe sort of late 1st century. It raises again the question of where the resurrection came from. I think it aids the historicist view of Jesus, which I've done a video about actually on Jacob's channel on the History Valley, because I think the early Christians are more obsessed with the crucifixion of Jesus rather than the resurrection. But essentially, we could spend the next 3 hours talking about how it impacts the field, because ultimately everything that's ever been written needs to be rethought because it just doesn't work anymore.
Marcus,
bring us the poetic answer, my friend.
Yeah, well, that's poetic, I'm not sure, but a pretty honest one would be the divinity of Christ, I think, is an idiosyncratic idea by Marcion. Because he doesn't believe, he's a good Platonist in this sense, he doesn't believe in history. And he tries everything in these, both in the gospel and in Paul's letters, to discredit what we believe and know as the value of a concrete life in time. And that's why, for him, the Savior has to be a divine figure, which comes from heaven and is disregarded by this world. This world, different from John's gospel, is not his own. He's not received by what is his own, but he is alien, just as the divine figure is alien. So first of all, I think if Marcion were first, I think then the belief in a divine Christ is a myth. It is a vision. So it's well up to your channel. The second element, I think, what it is that even the idea of God is a vision and maybe a myth, because he claims that this God has been unknown for all of the ages before the appearance of this divine figure. So no Jewish God, no other God of the Greeks, no other God of the Romans, no God. It's an Olympus of nobody.
Like you said, a faithful Platonist, this ultimate divine, almost nameless
Absolutely.
God.
So, and this is ungraspable, non-understandable. It is a wonder. And that's why this messianic figure has to be a wonder worker. So I think second or third now, so Christ's divinity, the divine himself, all divine acts, walking on water, going through doors, it's all myth. I think that's his idea. It's Platonic thinking. And I think we can go further, what Marcus has been saying, Jack, as well. I think most of what we think people believed is a replica of what they grasp from this visionary textual author who has, I'm sure, and that's what we try to explore, has some reliance on earlier traditions. So there is some historical graspable facts behind. Yeah. So we might come to the conclusion that there was a sort of Jesus. There was a sort of Paul. There were some people out there. There were probably even sayings that make very good sense, yeah, and which are extraordinary. But until we come to that stage, I think we still have to dig more into the data and the facts. But what I'm just thinking is, at the moment, the first century, in my view, as I tried to state in this Resetting the Christian Origins, a book which I published just last year with COP, Cambridge University Press, is a black box. And this is an image which even I didn't create myself. When I sent the publisher the draft of my book, he came back to me and said, "Oh, we shouldn't call it whatever I tried to call the book first, but we have to state that it is a black box, the first century, into which people put in whatever they want to believe and hope." So, Derek, you're in a good environment. You can put into the first century all the visions you have, and you will be right, because I think nobody can dispute it.
It is another way for, I am completely ignorant when it comes to ultimately navigating these without someone who's aware of the literature in and out. I mean, I've read the letters of Ignatius. I've read, I've read some of the letters of Origen, what he's written. I'm not like any way close to being a scholar or even aware of this material, but I'm aware that there's competitive nature in the early Christian church. As we know, we've been pointing out, you have accusations from early church fathers trying to say, look, Marcion did this. He redacted this Luke. And then you have, I'd like to get, if there's any evidence that you guys have vindicating Marcion based on your view, that actually his was earlier and they tacked on material. They padded it out to make it what they made it. I don't want to give too much information because I'd like to get an answer to that. But like, even when I spoke to Bart Ehrman, who's very traditional in his approach, completely traditional, and even students of his say he's outdated. Some of the stuff that he's doing is just dated, and it's, you can read this stuff from the 80s and he's still doing some of it. My question is there any evidence, as far as you're aware of, that someone in the early church is vindicating Marcion, or at least saying, hey, and I know winners wrote history, the guys in power, they wrote history and, preserved what they wanted to. And sometimes we get to see things that smoke, that shows fire, but that is saying actually, no, it's the other way around, or hinting at it. Is there anything you found that gives that kind of evidence?
Yeah, of course. Let me give you a nice story first, which explains it a bit, and then also a bit of a scrap, which indicates that. First of all, when Matthias Klinghardt first engaged with this question, he came to the conclusion in 2008 in an article that Marcion might be earlier than Luke, but still is later than Mark.
Mm-hmm.
Because he was doing these comparative studies, and he was adamant that Marcion relies on Mark as a gospel. When I invited him to the Oxford Patristic Conference in 2010, he was absolutely adamant that Mark is the earliest, one of the sources of Marcion's gospel. And then by studying the text itself, in light of all the evidences, all the witnesses, all the manuscript fragments and variations, he flipped the entire story and published a text in 2015, or 2-volume reconstruction of Marcion's gospel, by saying this is the earliest gospel. However, to save the New Testament romantic idea, I think, he claimed that Marcion didn't touch the text at all. He just made use of it. So you can see how you maneuver, how you twist the story by still preserving the old romantic appearance and vision.
So that this still goes before Marcion. It's this idea that oral, or even here's this text, it's still floating around. Marcion just used it. He didn't scribe it. You're suggesting we need to look at him as the brain behind the operation, at least to some degree. There may be others involved, but like, this guy plays a pioneering role. And if not, why do they spearhead him? Okay. Any other evidence that you have?
Yeah. When we look into every evidence we have from the 2nd century, and we start again with this nice Irenaeus, the bishop from the late 2nd century. Whenever he talks about the gospel as a text and the New Testament as a text, he engages with Marcion, and not with Valentinus, not with anybody else. He never engages with a pre-Lucan text. Nobody in the 2nd century knows of a text which is pre-Lucan. None.
That includes Matthew and Mark, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
We have then a scholar also from the 2nd century, very famous for at least the specialists, is Papias of Hierapolis. A scholar, we can't precisely date him, but around the mid-2nd century. He writes books about the Lord's oracles. So not stories apparently, but more, maybe some stories, but more the sayings. And here he gives a story about John, the gospel writer. And he knows and talks about a conversation between Marcion seeing John and discussing gospel writing, where in the story, of course, John is the hero. He claims that his gospel is the true one. And Marcion apparently claimed the same for himself. He produced what Mark called the antithesis, so the preface to his gospel. And Papias talks about it, that John, by reading this preface of the gospel, was appalled and thought, oh, that's a bad product. So mine is better. Which tells us that the gospel writing process is, and we might even be a bit skeptical when we talk about priority here. The gospel writing process was a process by which people like Marcion were writing, while at the same time John was writing. And they had engagement, like we tonight. They had engagement. Now, who of the four of us was first? The only thing I can say is I'm the oldest. Yeah. But so many ideas I got from Jack, I got from Mark, I got from one of your channels, from one of the sessions, yeah, and from the questions you ask. So I think it's nonsensical to talk in terms of priority and in genealogy, that A takes from, or B takes from A, C from B, D from C. No, I think it is a classic network experience that was made in the 2nd century, where some ideas certainly came from Marcion. I mean, probably pretty bright ones, yeah. For other people, pretty stupid ones. But how this process can be entangled is quite a problematic question.
And before you guys, because I'm going to let you guys have the panel here on the screen. I got to use the restroom real quick, but I want to make one comment. I realized why I brought up Bart Ehrman was that, in his orthodox corruption of scripture, he kind of does this. Well, they're responding to Marcion in the literature, but he places it later in church history, 3rd century and stuff, where he thinks that the scribes are doing it then. And that's probably because there's a lot of evidence of it happening then, but we have to go back and go, whoa. In our New Testament, and this is shocking to the fundamentalist, right? Like me, I'm speaking to myself 10 years ago. In your New Testament, the text we're reading, much of this is responding, I guess you'd say negatively, but giving their positive theology against this guy we call Marcion. That's a big deal. That's a huge deal. So I just want that to like sit on people's minds, even people like Bart, who have more of a classical, traditional German idea of romanticism and stuff view. He's seeing it and he's saying this is what's going on in the textual tradition and stuff. So anyway, Marcus,
Sure.
Jack,
I think that there needs to be a burden of pushing back against the Marcionite research that's happening, right? So, what Marcus, and if you look at Jason's text too, you find all these patterns where a bunch of features that are in the canonical text are not in the Marcionite text. So the names of all of Paul's friends, absent from the Marcionite text. All the places that Paul visited in Acts, most of them gone, right? So it doesn't make much sense that Marcion would just remove all of this stuff, where Paul talks about himself as a maternal figure, where Paul talks about his suffering. Like that stuff's not, so all the stuff that really aggrandizes Paul, that makes him look saintly and heroic and so on, that's all for some reason missing from Marcion's scriptures, even though Marcion was all about the glorification of Paul and following Paul as the main. But then the same thing happens with Jesus too. So in Marcion's Evangelion, all the travel references that you find in Luke's gospel are gone. All of the elaborate family and social structures around him, the names of all the disciples, right? You find all of these features again and again where you can just see that it's a simpler story versus a much more complicated and elaborate story. So I think the burden of proof now really needs to be on scholars like Ehrman and others to say, what is your theory of Marcion as a redactor who would do this? Like, how can you explain how all of this stuff is removed? Because a removal program doesn't make any sense of the data at all when you look at the depth of the patterns, the breadth of the patterns, the diversity of the patterns. And it's thematic, but it's also linguistic, it's geographic, it's every single facet you can think of to analyze the data. You see a more simple data set versus a far more complex and elaborate data set in all of these instances. But Derek's gone, but I guess we're in charge now. We kind of can take over.
You take over.
But I think that the challenge
I think I've killed him.
I think really seriously.
Resurrection! Here we go.
You missed you missed my best moments, Derek.
How did I do that? Jack, you were going to say something, and then because I know that we'll go on, and I wanted to not leave anyone hanging who had questions through super chats, try to get those knocked out. And what I'd like to ask before we have you do what you do, Jack, is that can we do this again? This is fun.
Pleasure.
Oh yeah.
All right.
Pleasure with us.
We
Jack,
can get
what
into
do you have
the
to
weeds
say?
too, if you want. If you really want to get into the weeds, we can get into the weeds, but it depends on what you and your audience want.
Okay, I'll leave it up to them. We'll do a Q&A. I'll do a community tab Q&A poll and like ask people, and it also let people who aren't aware, who didn't get notified because YouTube's weird like that. They might go, "Ooh, that's a topic I really do want to hear more on," and so they can get a heads up.
Yeah, why not? Yeah, great.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, the challenge to the current New Testament dating, to my mind, is actually Marcion is irrelevant. because the problems with dating the canonical Gospels in particular still is present without Marcion. Let's say in some crazy world, we understand that Marcion had no influence on the canonical Gospels in some crazy universe, yeah? We still have no evidence or quotation or reception of the canonical Gospels in the early church fathers. So their issue still remains. This is a separate question apart from Marcion. The fact that we have Marcionite scholarship, the fact that we're pushing that, is only in some ways a second string to that bow. They have to answer the first question first, which is, where did your canon go? And then answer what was the influence of Marcion on that. We're only a part of that problem. And the first problem they've known about, as Marcus said back in Kurt Alon's time, and they've just refused to answer it. They just don't want to engage with that as a question. And that's the big problem.
It's an interesting one to ask, especially for people like me who were like, we had our New Testament, the canon, these books were there right out the gate. And it's like, hold on, it took them how long to figure out to put these books together? You have diatessaurons popping up. You've got all sorts of fun stuff that they're trying to make sense of. And it's like, they wouldn't do that if there wasn't a problem, in my opinion. And there's so many things you guys have said on this stream that make me think. There's just so many things. Going with the data sets, Mark's trying to do this scientifically. Marcus, you've got me thinking about the social. Actually, it was Jack, I think, that really made me think of the social, like what's going on with Ignatius. And is it Ignatius or Irenaeus?
Both.
Both. Yeah, because there's a problem. It was Ignatius's letter to the Romans that freaked me out. I just read this last year and I was like, I hate to be controversial here, but like this was one of the most soundingly suicidal letters I have ever read. I want to die is like the subject matter of this chapter. It's like, dude, no, thank you, please. And if they won't kill me, I will insist and make them. And then I want to be the food in the belly of the beast, or it's just like, whoa, this is heavy. Pretty strong letters there. But all of these things make me think, like, what if you guys are right? And if you guys are right, what does this do? It just makes it even more like, can we know? And do you think you're going to hit a limit and saying, I can't go behind that? We can't reconstruct behind that. Or do you think there's going to be questions you'll never be able to answer unless we get further like evidence of it, like material evidence? Do you think you're going to hit a wall?
Look, that's like asking the cancer specialists whether they are going to hit a wall. I think there's no wall, right? But I think it's a long journey in front of us. I mean, we're just scrapping the surface, according to my views. I mean, I'm now reconstructing this earlier version of Paul, which has not been done, at least in the way we are able to doing it now, based on computer science. And for that, I mean, without Mark, I wouldn't have been able to doing what I'm doing at the moment, which cost me one more year, because a year ago I had done a reconstruction until we got to know each other, and it was like getting back to the whiteboard and start again. And so when I thought I'd hit a wall a year ago, it turned out that it's a universe in front of me. So, but what I can say is, I think we get a better understanding for the earlier version of Paul. And this Paul, and probably that's worth another session for sure. Mm-hmm. Probably we can even dig deeper into Paul. But I think this Paul that we are reconstructing right now is in many, many ways a very different Paul. Whether that's the historical Paul, I don't think. Whether it is based on a historical Paul, potentially yes. But you see, there are many more question marks that are being put behind Paul with that kind of reconstructive work. What I've also seen in the reconstruction, that we can trace what people have seen for a long time, that there's a difference between 7 letters and 3 letters, which in critical scholarship today, pretty normally are being called pseudo-Paulines, Ephesians, Colossians, and Second Thessalonians.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that indeed the lexicography, the texts, not just the content, but also the grammar, the style, and many, many other features, right, are linking these 3 letters with our canonical New Testament rather than with the 7 letters which are being credited to Paul. But I tell you, we are at the surface at the moment. We are scratching our fingers, and you will see I've not much fingers left here. So we're doing a hard work, But
This is
we are far from the
I'll
end.
give you one quick example. I heard that there's a dissertation that's about to come out at a prominent university about Romans 9 through 11 as the heart of Paul's letter to the Romans and Paul's whole theological program. That entire almost the entirety of it is missing from Marcion's texts. So that's just one example.
And to add more to that, the big chunk on which the Reformation was built, Romans 4, the same thing.
Yeah.
The Reformation, I think, is built on canonical later texts, not on
Paul. Because when I've looked, this is why we definitely needed to do a show, because I've delved into the various kind of interpretations of understanding Paul. I went down this rabbit trail. I can explain better in a session on that we have time. But Jason Staples, I don't know if you've heard of him. He's writing his on Israel and New Testament stuff, and he's been writing extensively on this. And what is Paul up to with Goyim or Gentiles?
The word Israel doesn't occur in his text.
Really? So this is, and it is odd that this is the only place in the entire Roman corpus, the letter to the Romans, that Israel is the name that gets brought up.
Again
it's
and
not
again and
mentioned
again.
Anywhere.
It's not in Marcion's text.
It'd be interesting to get your take here as you're reconstructing these, Marcus, the Jew Gentile dynamic maybe that might be in Paul's actual letters in your estimation, or at least an earlier version of it. What is the dynamic there, or is that all gone? And so let's talk about that sometime. I want to get to the super chats here. We have 5, I believe.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And then I'm going to wrap things up, and I encourage everybody. Mark, I know you wanted me to promote something.
Just the book that I deposited. It's got the little credit to you on it, but it's now live. The one that you chose.
Okay, this one?
The full Monty version. No, that's an Orchid link. I didn't send it to you before the show. I just sent it to you in private chat during the show.
Let me
It's got
see
the Zenodo link. So it does a DOI to
this one,
the Apostolos Attestate. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
And this is the book you said?
Oh yeah. It shouldn't be restricted though. Let me change that right now.
Okay. Yeah, someone asked about it and said it was restricted earlier too. So I'm glad that you're
sorry. I'll change. I was focused on the show.
No worries. I'm going to go ahead and post that again just so everybody has the book here. And do you want me to put this in the description?
Sure.
Okay.
I can tell you it's a very important book because I'm making use of it by doing my revision of the reconstruction.
Okay. There's a lot of links. Okay. Everybody forgive me in the description, but I got our guests' links are all first, and then later down the line, you catch MythVisions. But here's what the page should look like, and it won't say restricted. So have at it. All right.
It's live. It's live now. Yeah.
Perfect.
Thank you.
First question is from JC. Thank you for the 10, my friend. You rock. Consensus be damned. I appreciate these scholars challenging dogma. Can they do a quick recap of Marcion's life and how he got labeled a heretic, plus his work lost except in commentary plus Luke? Meaning, can you spend another hour and a half? I'm just kidding. Someone want to give a synopsis or
maybe just 2 or 3 sentences about it. He, according to the witnesses we have, he died before the year 161. So that's quite a secured date. So just after the mid of the 2nd century. So if you reckon he was an old man, so he might have been born around the turn of the 1st century. He was living in the north of today Turkey, in the Black Sea border, and his hometown was Sinope, which is the most northern city of today Turkey. It was one of the centers of the Roman army, and it was a town of an important Jewish community. pretty much as important as the Alexandrian community. And it was a Jewish community which is famous for the textual studies, because Aquila, a Jew, revised the Septuagint, the Jewish Greek Bible, in Sinope. And he is a contemporary of Marcion. Now, because Marcion is so obsessed with the Jewish writings, we know of nobody in the first 300-400 centuries, right, who would not be part of the wider Jewish community and engage with Jewish writings the way Marcion does. So that's why I wrote once an article about Marcion the Jew, because I think he comes from this kind of Aquileia background of Sinope, where he studied and learned studying and reading and writing. At the same time, he comes apparently from a wealthy background, because we know that he is a ship owner. He is not sailing and fishing, but he is lending ships to the Roman army, to other people. So he's making big money. And apparently, either he retired early like me, or without the big money, but or he just got fed up with the business, or he was running the business so well that he could spend most of the time, at least between the closure of the sea, which is from October to March, in Rome. And there he opens a study hall after the failure of the Second Jewish Revolt. So after 138, he must have moved to Rome, and he seems to have brought with him these texts, the Gospel and the 10 letters of Paul, which he put together only in Rome as a New Testament. And according to his own words, reported by Tertullian, he put together his New Testament because, as he says, his Gospel text was nicked by colleagues who also taught. And these texts were given the names of apostles and pupils of apostles. And just like Tertullian, who also publishes his text against Marcion, because it was stolen twice and published under his name, but in a revised version. So Marcion publishes his text with his preface, where he sets out these arguments that his text is different from these rogue versions, which today we know as the canonical Gospels, and publishes his New Testament to make sure people know that his New Testament is different from these poor versions, which make those links again with the Jewish tradition, which he tried to have severed. During his lifetime, he was never called a heretic. Tertullian claims that 20 years after his death, he was thrown out of the church. But how can you throw out somebody who was 20 years dead? So, I mean, this is non-starter. And the Marcionite community, which apparently he created in Rome, still is in sacramental community with the Catholic Church in the mid-3rd century. So far for this nonsense heretical stuff, right? So there was close relations even about 100 years after he had died.
Thank you so much. Victor Engelman, thank you for the super chat, my friend. Mark was named Marcion. Marcion was pronounced Marcion, or I guess you'd say. Mark's gospel also matches all infos that I know about Marcion's gospel. Couldn't Mark's gospel be a corrected, quote unquote, version of Marcion's gospel?
It's exactly what Klinghardt says.
So he's saying that Mark is trying to correct Marcion's.
Exactly.
And there's this
when you read my new book, which has just appeared a month ago, Christ's Torah, this is exactly what I'm trying to show, that Mark, particularly as the first one, starts using Marcion's gospel and correcting it. I know that Mark, who is sitting here with us, has a slightly different view. And I'm not saying that I can make a judgment right now, but about the pre-stages of Marcion's gospel, that's something we need to explore in more depth in the future. But we are not, I mean, I'm not able at the moment to have a firm view on that.
If I could follow up a little bit more about the question too, the words are quite similar in Greek, markon and markionan or markionas. I think markion would be considered a diminutive form. Am I correct in that, Marcus? A diminutive form of Marcos.
Exactly, small mark.
So, and then there is a little bit of confusion or conflation sometimes in the patristic witnesses. So Epiphanius sometimes will refer to Mark's gospel as Mark. He'll say that some group like the Manichaeans affiliate this with Markionas. So there is some ambiguity, and in the Epiphanius, also writing late 4th century, says that the opening of Mark's gospel is what was it? No, he says the opening of Luke he says the opening of Mark is Luke 3:1. That's what it is. That's what I'm trying to remember.
So what is quite clear, if you compare Mark with Marcion, there are large sections of Marcion's gospel which are missing in Mark. So that somebody could come to the idea and say, oh, well, this is the small Marcion of the small Marcion.
Thank you so much.
Not be too far from it.
JC, how did Marcion get Paul's letters? Can Dr. Vincent give a preview of what key elements of authentics are missing in your reconstruction versus canonized?
That's a very good question. I'd like to defer that question to another session because I think the answer would be longer. But just to have one sentence on it, we are not quite clear where he got this text from, these 7 letters, and whether the form in which these 7 letters are preserved in Marcion's collection, how close they are to potential letters of Paul. This is a big question I have, and on which we would need to go into detail. The other 3 letters he must have derived from an environment which is very close to the people who do the redaction of the texts so that they become canonical texts. That's what I can say.
We're going to have to dive. Yeah, we're going to have to. This is, and by the way, I'd love to do, we could do panels. We could also do just having you, Dr. Vincent, and having you, Jack. We could plan out some stuff because I'd like to get your specialties. And I feel like the panel might even distract from being able to hone in on that one thing. And, yeah. So, okay. Victor Engelman again says, and thank you so much for these super chats. How can all known letters of Paul have passed through Marcion? The only plausible explanation, in my honest opinion, is that Marcion invented Paul.
Yeah, I thought that as well, and I had to reject that idea. Not because I want to historicize Paul or I want to hang on to these romantic storylines so that at the end we have a Paul, right? So that was not my intention. But what I discovered is that when you look into the lexicography of these texts, you can see there are stumbling elements which are not liked even apparently by Marcion as a redactor. We can see it in the gospel probably more easily than in Paul, but we can also see it sometimes in Paul. In the gospel, for example, we have this story that Jesus has come to bring the sword and to divide people and to engage in disruption, which is very much against the grain of Marcion's attempt to redact the texts. And we have similar elements in Paul. So I do think, despite my love for MythVision, it is not just myth, but there are some facts behind. But to unravel those facts, we have to be visionaries and data scientists.
So poetic. You know what? I do want to, I think it's worth it. You've done it the whole show. I might as well emphasize this. I think there was a guy. And I don't only think there was a Paul, I think there was a Jesus. Not because I need there to be a Jesus. It just, to me, makes the most sense in my head based on what I've researched and looked at, that they mythologize the hell out of this guy, to me. Okay. But at the end of the day, when I named the channel MythVision, I was a mythicist. I did think that Jesus didn't exist. But I'm glad I didn't name it Mythicist Vision, because then it would limit it to possibly being mythicist only. However, I was fully convinced, and I think I am encouraging viewers that we're dealing with mythology in these materials, and that we should embrace that, not try to reject it or try to hide it. And I think that sometimes first you think, haha, I got the fundamentalists, but then you start kind of enjoying the fact that we're dealing with legends and myths, and that's where the fun is to me now. It's not like I got you and I get to poke you in the eye. Sure, I get to poke you in the eye a little if you're a fundamentalist, but there's some other fun to literary inventiveness and creativity and stories and stuff. Absolutely. And you find it all over. So I just had to address that so you understood that, like, my goal is along the way to have our vision notice the mythology or the legend, sometimes used synonymous, but there is distinctive, like myth usually has no historical veracity, whereas legend can be a mix of both. I'm not getting overly picky about the definitions, but I think it's important just to emphasize that for the viewers. But yeah, thank you. John D, thank you so much for the super chat. What are the implications if Marcion's collection of Paul's letters had priority? Not even a Christian or New Testament scholar. And the idea makes me queasy. So he's saying, I'm not a scholar, but the idea makes me queasy. Like, oh crap.
In simple terms, it means that what we've been taught is the New Testament, is Paul, are the Gospels. These are all early Orthodox, mid-2nd century creations. The Paul you think you're reading, that you think is the historical Paul, and that scholars routinely tell you, this is what Paul's about. I'll tell you about Paul. This is the real Paul, the Paul of the letters. That's a mid-2nd century Catholic or early Orthodox creation. There's just so much extra that's put in when you compare Marcion's text with this. Again, like Paul has a minimal social network. So a lot of the people that are just standard associates of Paul, like Timothy and Barnabas, they're gone. Titus is there, but very minimal. He doesn't have this massive fundraising. There's a fun one. In Marcion's Paul doesn't really care about money or ask for money or talk about how much he works, what a hard worker he is and working with his own hands and all that, the kind of ethic you find in the Didache, like person doesn't work, he doesn't eat. That's not there. But in the canonical Paul's letters, he's trying to raise funds like a beast, right? He is a fundraising machine extraordinaire, especially 2 Corinthians, but throughout. And he's really good at giving guilt trips to try to get people to give him money.
Yeah, right? I'm not asking for money.
There's a whole fundraising Paul program and a hagiography Paul. Paul's an apostle in the early one, but he's not really a saint. The Catholic version makes him into a saint. The Paul of the letters, again, the authentic Paul, he's also just self-obsessed. So you read Marcion's Paul, he doesn't talk about himself, but in the canonical Paul, Paul's always talking about himself, nonstop. It's the canonical Paul, the New Testament Paul, is a narcissist. The Marcionite Paul's not. He doesn't really care about himself that much. He's not talking about himself that much. He's focused on other things.
How often do you guys get emails about going to hell?
It is interesting that the more historical you get into the canonical Paul, and the more facts, the more fiction it is.
Okay. There's less legend, less embellishment, less fanciful.
It shows that the more of the New Testament is legendary. That the legends are far more encompassing than we think.
And particularly if they give a quasi-historical taste to it.
Right.
So the code which Paul has forgotten, or any kind of these historical details, right? Or the relation to Timothy, or whatever it is.
Or all the places he visited, or spending 14 years doing this and writing to that guy, and all that stuff.
It's like legends. I mean, legends grow by adding quasi-historical facts to facts. Facts, yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was going to say, how often do you get emails about you're going to hell? Because this is definitely controversial.
Yeah, I actually got lambasted on Twitter maybe 6 months ago by Catholics. I am a Catholic. I remain a practicing Catholic, but these guys just sent me maybe 50, 100 tweets, just absolutely lambasting me for days. And I think it's quite amusing, really. But it's you bring up Marcion to a bunch of fundamentalists or even non-fundamentalists. Although on saying that, even some secular scholars didn't really want to talk to me at a conference because of Marcion. So it's not just the Christians. We won't just blame them.
Wow. Well, I hope that changes, and I hope episode starts to set a different tone on the scale, because a lot of academics do watch MythVision, and there's some real good conversations we have here. Sorry you had to deal with that, Jack, but I want to say this as someone who's not a person of the faith anymore. But I'm glad someone like you exists. I'm glad it's not just a bunch of guys up here who might have a non-faith position or don't participate in the church. I don't. I'm glad you do. And you're seeing this, and that, in my opinion, gives it more credibility that, hey, here's a guy against all odds and for no good reason is drawing this conclusion when his fellow members and brothers in the community are saying, that's our arch nemesis. How dare you? So I'm glad that you're sticking to your guns and going based on facts and not just tradition.
Well, it's becoming, I think, more. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jack.
I was just going to say Marcus is the arch heretic, so it's really him that's the problem. But
yeah, no, it's not about it's not about heresy. But what it is about, I think, is collaboration and teamwork and scientific inquiry, right? And if you just start with the heretical category, you can just keep dismissing and ignoring Marcion's texts and just go on about your merry way. But I think we're starting to see in this moment in history a coming together where scholars are starting to work together and collaborate and, benefit from each other's work. And, it's like there's so much energy put into creating the critical edition of the New Testament. And we need to realize that's trying to tame a massive diversity of evidence, just like Marcus was talking about before. Like, you have so many different manuscripts of what people thought the Bible was. There was not one Bible. The whole idea of like a Bible, that's a myth, right? There's many different Bibles. So the whole modern critical effort to create a critical edition that is authoritative, that is standardized, that changes very minimally, if at all, that takes a lot of curation and care and consensus building. And that shows you where the energy is. There's so much energy into creating those kinds of things. But I think now we're starting to see there's enough of a critical mass of scholars who are interested in just ferreting the stuff out and looking at it seriously and honestly, that we're kind of entering into a new moment, I think, where this is going to be taken more seriously. And the more people just do data science, it's becoming so much more easy to do data science in these days. Like this is why we did a Kaggle competition, like companies like GE, and Pfizer, they'll put up competitions on Kaggle or Google, and they'll have thousands, tens of thousands of people working a problem, and they come up with meaningful solutions, and then they share that with each other. Like, we're in the moment of open source code, open science, open literature, open data, open access. So there's a lot of money and energy around that, and a big shift to the digital humanities and academia that, well, at the same time, a lot of religious studies positions are disappearing. So I think we're in this moment, Derek, where a lot of the people that were the movers and shakers in religious studies, like half of their positions will be gone in the next 10 to 20 years. But data science positions and digital humanities positions will continue to multiply. And the more that we just free this stuff up so that anybody can research it, and it's not just the province of super specialists who read 10 languages and read classical languages, the more we democratize this area, the further we'll get in the study, and the more we'll just change the way the whole discourse goes.
Thank you. Two more, and then I do have to go. The Mythic Life, thank you for the super chat. Can we discuss Marcion's interpretation of the Old Testament God in contrast to our traditional Orthodox view?
Yeah, shall I pick it? This, again, I think would be worth a full session. But just from my perspective, I think the biggest difference is that the so-called Old Testament God has numerous, at least in the Jewish writings, numerous human-like features. So he is loving, but he is also hating. He has peace on his mouth, but then he's cursing people. And I think this worried Marcion particularly, as he was writing after the defeat of the Jews against the Romans. It was a massive blow to follow up of the Danielic interpretation of the Messiah. Daniel's interpretation was that he would be a Messiah coming to restore peace, but by killing a number of the princes before. And I think the experience of having a Jewish Messiah, Bar Kochba, as the frontman of this disastrous defeat in the Second Jewish War, I think Marcion could no longer put up with an interpretation of the Old Testament by claiming that this Old Testament God would need warriors fighting their cause against the Romans in order to reestablish the state of Israel.
I have so many questions on that. Just that came up when you said something. I was like, oh my gosh, we got to talk about Bar Kokhba. We got to talk about all sorts of interesting things that play into that. JC says Steve Mason shows Luke, Gospel of Luke. We all know what we're talking about here. Used Josephus. Legendary details from Josephus added in by later gospel authors and editors and more as historical biofictions.
Yeah, I would say Josephus cuts both ways. I think he gives us, reasonable historical information about what's going on in, early to mid to late first century. But yes, Steve Mason's absolutely right. There are many, many spots where canonical Luke is using Josephus, but not actually using it very well. There's often like mixing up of the order of names or confusing the dates of things. But I think he wants to make whoever wrote canonical Luke, in the 130s, 140s or whatever, that redaction wanted to make his text sound like historiography, like apologetic historiography, defending this movement. It's similar to what Justin Martyr was trying to do. And so he'll tell stories like about the Tower of Siloam in Luke 14. That sounds a little bit like something in Josephus, but he's completely fabricating it. Like it's highly, highly embellished. There was no collapse of the Tower of Siloam, in Josephus. There's just a reference to Siloam and a pond down there, but Luke tells it and then uses gematria, the number 18, which is also the number of the age of the it's the gematria for the name of Jesus. But then a woman, I think previously a woman who had been in bondage for 18 years, right? So there's a match of 18 and 18 right there. So there's numerical plays going on there. There's elaboration that again takes Josephus as kind of a jumping point, but then goes way beyond what Josephus is trying to do. So yes, it's absolutely trying to make it sound like plausible historiography, but it's really quasi historiography in a lot of these cases.
Perhaps I should add that in more recent times, critical scholarship becomes even more skeptical about what Josephus seems to know about Christians. We have to know that Josephus has only exclusively been transmitted for hundreds of years by Christians. Yeah. And when we know about all the changes that have been done to Christian literature, we can imagine that similar undertakings have taken place with the works of Josephus. The Testamentum Flavianum is one of the major examples for that, but also what he talks about John the Baptist and other things, right? So we need to be very cautious. Like the Pliny Trajan letter exchange, why would this letter be the only letter in the entire collection of almost 100 letters which claims to have been sent to the emperor in secrecy? So sealed, as a sealed letter, the only one amongst all of the other letters.
Because this is the most important issue.
It raises doubts. I mean, at least in my mind.
Yeah. This is, there's so much. We got to do more. And by the way, I don't know why Darth Vader came into my head when I read this. And then you started talking. I was like, Luke, like Marcion saying, Luke, Father. You know what I mean? I don't know why. Matthew K says, late Christmas gift and a Happy New Year, my friend. Thank you, Matthew. And for everybody watching, I appreciate, much love to you and your family, Derek. I appreciate all that you do and the guests you bring on. And I appreciate all the guests. They always spill the beans, teach us all the cutting edge stuff and hearing various arguments. We love to bring on new ideas. And this is new. And this is long overdue. I've been twisting Jack Bull in the private chat. Does he want to come on or does he not want to come on? What the heck? So we're here and it happened, and I thank you all. Are there any final words from each of you, and then I will end the stream?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And all the questions are always a stimulus for further research. So thanks so much.
Thank you. I just wanted to give you guys a final say. Let's do this again. I will done it because I'm so busy all the time, to make a poll on the community tab, and we'll get some chats going, maybe on Facebook as well, my Facebook group, to get people's ideas of what they think and what they'd like to see covered. I know that we have plenty of topics. So thank you guys. I really appreciate it.
Cheers.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Derek.
Thanks.
Thank you. Don't go